We're live with you now from Brazil, through the US, up to Canada. Welcome, and thanks for some very interesting presentations on a complex and contested topic. And for those of you in the audience that are feeling a bit overwhelmed, have no fear. You can always watch this again. These videos will be available on the website. And as you saw, some of the speakers kindly provided some further reading, which you can download their presentations. And we also have a C2G evidence brief on this topic as well. You can download from the website. Just a few clarifications. There's, as you heard from the speakers, there's these are proposed concepts. There's lots of uncertainty around them. But you probably picked up a few different terms in those different presentations. So it's good to clarify terminology. We refer to this as a solar radiation modification in line with the IPCC's most recent classification. It's also referred to as solar radiation management, solar geoengineering, climate engineering, or geoengineering, amongst other things in the literature. So don't be confused. It's generally, these are the common umbrella terms used to refer to these technologies and approaches. But as Anna Maria highlighted, this SRM and Doug also, it covers a variety of approaches. So I'd like to ask, as we now move to the Q&A session, when you're posing questions to the speakers, and indeed speakers when you're responding, could you ensure there's a little bit of specificity, if possible, not just referring to SRM, because as Anna Maria rightly pointed out, you know, there are big implications for the different type of approach, certainly on the governance questions. And also just one other point I just wanted to clarify, Doug, with your presentation, you mentioned that SRM might offset collective CO2 emissions so far. And I presume you're referring to the warming that's caused by those collective emissions. Is that right? Yeah, good.
Yeah, I just meant global mean temperature.
Sure, I know you clarified it later in the presentation, but that's, yeah, we assume that was the case. So good. So now to the questions. We have, what do we have? We have approximately 35 to 40 minutes for questions. We've got a lot of participants who've obviously joined us previously, and they found the Q&A button, have already started sharing questions. The Q&A button's at the bottom here. Don't use the chat button. You won't get through to us on that. And my colleague Paul is in the background here going through these questions and sending them on to me. And we'll begin. We've had a few through already. So I'm just going to start. I'll throw the question to each three of you in turn. Give us a wave or indicate if you'd like to pick up the question there. Otherwise, I'll pick one of you and pose the question to you. And hopefully we'll get through as many as we can. So participants, start feeding your questions through now. No question is too stupid or too ignorant. This is a complex topic. A lot of us are new to it. And we've got some world experts here for just 35 to 40 minutes. So let's make use of their experience and their knowledge. So let's start off. I think a broader question that was posed to begin with, which was, why is there a focus on, why is there not a focus on lower temperature targets than the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement goal? So we had a lot of talk about the Paris Agreement goal, but why not focus on even lower temperature targets? Who would like to pick that one up? Thelma, go ahead. If you could unmute yourself, and then we can hear your answer.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Nick, and those very good presentations from our colleagues. So great. Let me see how we could focus on responding to this question. Obviously, the Paris Agreement has mentioned as one of its goals to be well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to be 1.5. When this was done, you know, the IPCC had released in 2014 the 5th assessment report, and we didn't have too much information, scientific publication, even to address the 1.5 impacts of 1.5 and potential emission pathways to lead us to limit global warming at the end of the century at 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. So obviously, and in particular, there has been an incredible push by the small islands, you know, which are already suffering a lot of impacts from sea level rise and would be very much impacted even by the 1.5. We know that 1.5 is not is not distributed evenly in terms of global warming everywhere. Some regions are much more affected, and obviously going below 1.5 would be the most and the most positive way to have equity in order to have impacts on different regions. And I already mentioned the small island states. We don't have too much literature on how much would be the impact, how could we get to 1 degree Celsius, as we definitely developed when we had the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming of 1.5 that IPCC produced in response to an invitation from the Climate Change Convention, and to meet the expectations from the Paris Agreement. So we need to have efforts to try to understand what potentially would be the impacts of 1 degree Celsius, and also which emission trajectories could lead us to that. I'm about to finish. One of the issues that we really appreciated in the 1.5 report of the IPCC was the fact that past emissions and the present emissions would have not compromised yet, the planet to be committed to 1.5. That response also has to be given to 1. We are already at 1. So it is around 1, right? With the range of uncertainty due to human activities. So we are already there. So how to really try potentially, doing all these negative emissions and use all the technologies, this is still to be pursued. Obviously, we should pursue it, but I think it is complicated as it is already for the 1.5. Sorry for the long response to
Thank
this.
you. No, thank you, Thelma. A very comprehensive answer there. If I might move on to another question. Given that the number of SRM experiments is accelerating, so we're seeing certainly news of more experiments of these different technologies and approaches, how urgent is it for governance to be in place? And there's some follow-up questions as well. Are there any signs that this is happening? And if so, where and by whom? In addition, is there a danger that the research might outpace governance capability and capacity? So is there an urgent need for governance to be in place? Are there signs this is happening? And if so, where and by whom? And is there a risk that research might outpace the governance capability and capacity? Who'd like to take a first go at that one? Anna Maria or Doug? Or Anna Maria, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the great question. So yeah, we're starting to see experiments take place, including a cloud brightening experiment in Australia, most recently in discussion of the Scopex experiment in the US on stratospheric aerosol injection. And so I'm going to give this a classic lawyerly response, which to your first question, which is how urgent is it that we have governance in place? Well, it depends. It really depends on who you ask. So some scientists say that this talk of governance and the need for a socially accountable response for the development of science and technology is really holding back the science and tech development. And so we need to have as light a touch as possible on the research. On the other hand, there's a lot of examples of how we've sort of not governed emerging technologies properly, and this has led to some less than desirable outcomes. And so it really depends on your particular perspective. In my view, I think given the particular nature of these technologies and some of their more novel aspects, and just in general, the need for better practices surrounding the governance of emerging technologies that are socially controversial, uncertain, and so forth, I think it is necessary that we have governance in place. There has been some literature on this topic about what would make for an appropriate governance response to scientific research. I've done some of this research myself, looking into this idea of the need for a code of conduct or high-level principles advanced by scholars at the University of Oxford and so forth. So there is a discussion, actually quite a rich literature on this topic already. the question of how or whether it should be implemented, yeah, that's another big question. So, for example, the ScopeX experiment, they're putting together an advisory board, or they have an advisory board, and they have some governance in place for their own experiment that's sort of put in place by the proponents of the experiment and the institution itself. And so one of the questions is this a matter for internal regulation? Who should have a say in the scope and structure of governance of research and so forth? Is there a concern that governance will be outpaced by scientific experiments? As I said, there are two sides to this. I think some in the scientific community who work on this topic think we've had way too much governance talk and we just need to crack on with this. That's not particularly my view. But we haven't seen governments take a huge role in advancing governance to date, or even really engage with this topic to any great extent. And so, yeah, that might change. I think there are signs that it is changing, but yeah, to be continued.
Thanks, Anna Maria. Doug, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to make two additional comments on top of that. One is the U.S. National Academies. One of the things that it is tasked with is coming up with recommendations on research governance. And obviously one aspect of that is recommendations on what to do in terms of experiments. Of course, that's a U.S. body, but you know, we can try to make recommendations that would be relevant globally. And then the second comment is just, you know, having been involved in the scientific discussions for more than a decade, broadly, there's two experiments that have been proposed. One is the ScopeX experiment, which would be measuring, you know, putting like a kilogram of material to measure some chemical reaction rates in the stratosphere. And then the second is marine cloud brightening experiment to try to understand some of the cloud aerosol interactions. I don't personally expect that there's going to be a giant flood of experiments. In addition to those, there may be a few additional ones that get proposed along the time, but they really haven't been. It's not like there's been a giant flood of people saying, oh, I want to do this, and I want to do this, and I want to do this. The reality is that right now, the research funding is so small that even if somebody did want to do them, there's no money to do the experiment. So I think we have some time to actually get not a lot of time, but I actually do think that there is, right this instant, we can put the governance in place for those experiments ahead of a flood of experiments happening. Okay,
good to know. Anna Maria, did you have a further follow-up to that? Thanks, Doug.
Actually, I'll just pass. That's good.
Okay, sure. We haven't, if I could, Thelma, yes. Do you want to add? If you unmute yourself, that would be, you need to unmute yourself, Thelma.
Yep.
There we go, great.
Thanks, Nick. Just a quick response to this. Obviously, we are expecting, you know, from the IPCC perspective, because IPCC does the assessment of the literature that is available, right? So even in the 2022 assessment report, we are going to have more information on solar radiation modification and the climate response also to it. So we are hoping to increase our understanding in the next report. But obviously, with all these experiments, I think that, you know, we will be more and more information flooding in. Now, but, you know, even if we do this assessment, even if we publish not only IPCC, but other sources as well, this has to be discussed in a setting that has already been suggested, where all governments have the same level of understanding, including on the potential impacts, regional impacts of some of these solar radiation modification methods. So some of them more mature and others not as much. So the fear that might exist is that, you know, experiments are being carried out specifically by a group of researchers that might trigger unilateral actions from governments, which would be the worst of the scenarios. Because, you know, governments, not all the governments that could be impacted by the methods would, you know, be able to voice their concerns and be on the same page on this. So, and this is how I potentially see the complex discussion on this issue on a level of governance, multilateral, discussions. If we take the Climate Change Convention, for instance, where we could bring this issue to be discussed under the umbrella of the Paris Agreement, or under SBSTA, which is the subsidiary body of scientific and technology advice. If we consider how long it takes to have an agreement, to have a consensus on the discussion of these issues, we see that it adds to the complexity. So we hope that, a chance be given to have a broader research arena that would bring more countries into it, and not be to a selective group of people, so that everyone could understand better, engage, and be in the same level. It is not a very simple governance issue to be resolved, as Anna has already mentioned the issues that we have in front of us for this. Really complex issue to be discussed broadly.
Indeed, thank you, Thelma. Anne-Maria, did you want to come back on that?
Unmuting. Hi. Yeah, I tend to agree, and I think we use, in some cases, the most benign language to talk about the governance risks in relation to, for example, stratospheric aerosol injection. This idea, how do we manage SRM as we bring emissions down, and that it brings with it a whole load of assumptions that personally I think can be questioned, especially now as we see this pull away from multilateralism within the international system, states acting alone, declaring their sovereign interests, flouting the rule of law, and so forth. And so this idea that we'll just sort of manage this as we rapidly bring down emissions over a certain period of time, I think ignores many of the frailties of the international system that we have in place for governing state affairs. And so I just want to point that out, that that's one of the issues. So not just the issue of, I think, managing SRM over time and continuing it, having the necessity for stable governance with agreement amongst all states. Agreement would be voluntary at the international level, and so you really only need one big outlier to cause a risk of unilateral deployment of SAI in particular. We also have the idea that many states might be doing lots of different things as sort of patchwork implementation. I think this is pretty predictable given how we have areas within and areas beyond national jurisdiction and how that's regulated under international law, those kinds of activities. And this sort of patchwork without coordination could, carry to a certain scale, produce a lot of chaotic effects within the climate system. I think the third thing is this idea that we can somehow adequately tie the governance of SRM to the reduction of mitigation and the risks that those two have in tandem. We haven't seen hugely great progress on reducing emissions. And though we've talked a lot about the moral hazard, we haven't talked about what governance mechanisms and legal mechanisms in particular could be used to tie the two so that you can mitigate that risk of a moral hazard or mitigation deterrence. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done on many of these topics, and that the assumption of the best case scenario in telling the narrative of governance is really problematic.
Thank you, Anna Maria. And we've got some very fascinating questions coming in. So keep adding your questions in the panel below. And you can also vote up questions if you approve, and we'll try and push those further up the list to us. There's a lot coming through. So Anna Maria, you mentioned moral hazard there, which is this concept that was raised in some of the presentations as well. And we have a question: is the use of SRM being meaningfully linked to discussions about reducing fossil fuel use in a joined up manner with a view to avoiding or minimizing this moral hazard problem? Who'd like to have a go at that one? Any ideas?
I can just expand on my last point, which is we haven't, although we've discussed the moral hazard problem, I don't think we've really gotten stuck into the question of how to address it, what mechanisms, principles, and norms we could use to prevent that scenario from playing out. And I think it's quite complicated. So I haven't heard this idea of tying it to fossil fuel companies directly. That, I guess, in principle could be an option. But I don't think that that's a particularly easy task, especially given that the actors who are doing the mitigation might not be the ones who are promoting SRM as a response. And so in a voluntary international legal system, how do you make that work? How do you tie that together? And there's no way of binding other actors without their consent at the international level. And that's where it starts to become problematic. And I think we've seen certain countries already start to, advance these arguments that SRM is, part of their right to develop and so forth. Their need to maintain their economies on the basis of a business as usual scenario, reliance on fossil fuels and so forth. And so I think it's actually quite a difficult problem to address.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else like to come back on that? Otherwise, I have a follow-up question from the audience. Thelma.
No, very, very quickly as usual. Nick, the IPCC, both in the AR5, the last assessment report, and also in the recent special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, it sees, the solar radiation management being used in overshoot scenarios. I mean, those scenarios where, before 2100, the temperature increased beyond 1.5, and then it has to be pushed back. And obviously, the more we go above 1.5, the more we are going to have to rely on not only SRM, which I think it's the last resource that is indicated in the literature. So first, very ambitious emission reductions, and then followed by CDR. CDR, and then, complemented as necessary to bring the overshoot scenarios down to 1.5 or lower, obviously. So I liked to put this in perspective because I think it helps. It is not the immediate method that the literature points out to be used without exploring both ambitious mitigation plus CDR.
Thank you, Thelma. A coupled question here. Could SRM ever allow those who will benefit from warming to continue to benefit whilst also cooling where cooling is needed? I.e., can there be a win-win outcome of using SRM? What do we know about that? If anything.
I'm going to not quite answer that question, although I also want to just
give it a go.
Questions briefly, which is just to say that. So let me say two things. One is there are ways with, for example, marine cloud brightening that you could focus the cooling a little bit more in one region relative to others. With stratospheric aerosols, in principle, you could focus a little bit more effort in the Arctic relative to other areas. But you don't get to just wall off the climate system. And the second point I want to make is just much more broadly. Somebody commented on the fact that none of us actually mentioned things like acid rain. I also didn't mention ozone depletion, for example, both of which would occur with stratospheric sulfate aerosols. Ultimately, we need to sort of say, here's what all of the impacts would be if you chose to do things, and what those impacts are depend on how you're doing it, not just the method, but like what latitudes do you inject aerosols at. And that sort of all needs to be evaluated in the context of what would happen if you didn't do this. And I suspect that you will find that there are some places in the world that would say, great, this is better than not doing it. And there's other places in the world that might say, actually, no, we'd rather have a little bit of warming. which is effectively why we need both the research to understand what those impacts are, and we need to make sure the governance is in place prior to the point at which somebody might be trying to make a decision about deployment.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Anna Maria, do you want to add to that? Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm living in a country where warming might be a benefit. So it's October here and it's still 20 degrees and people are commenting on how their tomatoes are still on the vine and ripening, and isn't this a bit kind of gardening benefit? But I think someone who works in the Laos Sea, for example, Arctic nations are really starting to consider the potential benefits of a ice-free Arctic and what that means for shipping and commerce, for example. So there are potentially some benefits for some countries under a warming scenario, depending on how you see it. And I think that's really the point, which is what constitutes a risk or a benefit is ultimately a matter of perception. It depends on your the social, cultural, political, economic, and so forth. Concepts that you bring to it, ideas that you bring to it. And so this will make a global conversation about some of these technologies actually quite challenging, and is another basis. For example, many UN institutions operate by trying to achieve consensus. And so the idea of achieving consensus, given that there are all these different perspectives, that may come into play on a single unitary technology is potentially quite problematic.
For sure. Thelma, did you want to come in on that, or shall I move to the next question?
It has been covered already by Do and Anna.
Yeah, good. Okay, thanks. So, I mean, let's move on to risks. Actually, we've had a question about what can you tell us more about what we understand about the risks of SRM, other than in terms of precipitation that was mentioned in the presentation. So in particular, in relation to SAI, for example, with regard to potential risks to biodiversity, the health of not only humans, but to all species, and changes to atmospheric dynamics. So sort of pivoting from your tomatoes, you know, what do we know about the risks to biodiversity and the health of all species from potential deployment in future of SAI? Who'd like to have a first go at that?
I can say a little bit about that. The sort of following up from what I said before is yeah, we need to evaluate all of the impacts and risks, both from what would happen if you were to deploy something versus what not. Personally, I'm actually far more worried about the geopolitical challenges, societal challenges, than the actual direct physical impacts. So we mentioned the fact that the precipitation patterns would change a little bit. How important that is depends a whole lot on whether you're comparing to a world with the same emissions and a higher temperature, or whether you're viewing it as, was this a choice between doing mitigation or doing this? If you view it as that choice, SRM is always going to lose. It would always be better to, for the same global mean temperature, to have achieved that by cutting your emissions. In terms of direct physical risks, so some shifts in precipitation patterns, a small amount of acid rain, pretty tiny contribution compared to what we currently do with industrial pollution. But if you're in an area that's currently pristine, that might be a little bit more significant. Some reduction in stratospheric ozone if you use sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere. Again, you know, that has to be in context with everything else. And then one that's maybe not appreciated quite so much is, again, with sulfate aerosols, you scatter light in all directions. And so in order to reflect some back to space, you actually scatter in all directions and you reduce the direct light and increase the diffuse. That has unknown consequences for ecosystems. If you're doing marine cloud brightening, it only works over something like 10% of the globe. And so if you're trying to cool the entire planet by putting a really big forcing in a really small area, it's likely that that will have some ecosystem impacts in the ocean directly underneath where you're applying it. That has never been looked at all in any significant way. So sort of, there's a long list of stuff that, quite frankly, the research hasn't really been done to say the answers in full detail. But as I said at the start of that answer is quite frankly, it's like, if you compare that with what happens if we allow the planet to warm by 3 degrees, maybe the answer is those risks are worth accepting. I don't think that's up to me to answer, just to put it in context.
Do we think, I'd like Anna Maria and Thelma to have a chance to come back on this one, but first a quick follow-up that seems pertinent here. Another question that was, are the uncertainties of not using SRM greater than the uncertainties of using it as a complement to mitigation and CDR currently? Do we know much about that? Is there much in the literature about that?
Broadly, the answer is probably the uncertainties would be larger if you don't do it. In the sense that a lot of the uncertainties are temperature dependent uncertainties. And so if you allow the climate to warm, you're pushing the climate into a state that we don't have much knowledge about. And if you prevent the climate from warming, we sort of have more knowledge about that state. But it really, it depends on the specific thing that you're interested in.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Doug.
Uncertainty is not a binary,
No.
There's not just one thing to be certain about.
Indeed. Thanks for that, Doug. Anna Maria or Thelma, would you like to come back on that, what we know about the risks, or indeed what we don't know? And Doug pointed out, known unknowns, but maybe there's some unknown unknowns as well. Any thoughts on that with regard to risks, Thelma?
Yeah, thanks, Dick. Thanks for the question as well. Well, we don't know many things yet. And also the level of understanding and knowledge is very different for the different methods that we put under the broad umbrella of SRM, right? So as we have already said, we know a lot of stratosphere aerosol injection. It's the most studied method, but for the other ones, we don't have much. And, but the literature, and this is recent literature, still suggests that other than the stratospheric aerosol injection, the other methods are not assessed to be able to substantially reduce the overall global temperature, right? So also in the 1.5, it relates to the ground-based albedo modification as being able to contribute to regional mitigation. And the other ones, like, the marine clouds, cirrus cloud thinning, not even being able to do that. So we still have lots of uncertainties, not only related to the contribution of these methods and what to say of their potential impacts. I think that Doe has explored some of the risks that we have, in particular with the stratospheric aerosol injection, with the SAI, but there is still a lot to be known about the other methods at large, including their contribution to cooling.
Okay, thank you, Thelma. Anna Maria, anything you'd like to add, or shall I move on? Okay. We're getting close to the end of our time now. So any final burning questions that you have out there, please drop them in the box. And we're trying to get through as many as we can. Apologies, we haven't reached your question yet. Perhaps a final question, or close to final question for our three speakers. How likely is it that a governance agreement will be reached before we get to 3 degrees? Or will the stakeholders just talk until 2050 and beyond? So I guess implied in this question is the question of how can progress be made in SRM governance? And that includes, it's probably worth pointing out, governance may indeed include the decision whether or not to even consider it. Indeed, whether or not to research it, whether or not to deploy it, all of those questions might come under this governance discussion. Any thoughts on that question or those two questions? Crystal ball gazing a little. Or indeed, how can progress be made, do we think? What are the next steps in order to move forward?
Okay, so let me just try a go here. So, governments, especially in the Climate Change Convention, so we have the Paris Agreement, we have the goals, so we have already talked about that. But governments also want to get to know the implications of these methods at large, especially, solar radiation modification. And it was interesting to see that one of the gaps was really to understand the climate response to solar radiation management, which was not clear in the previous publications of the IPCC. And they asked it to be addressed. So governments are asking this issue to be addressed, which is a good signal. It's a good signal because from knowledge, from science, this can inform the decision-making process in the forum where politically they would have to decide this. As I already mentioned, this is not easy. We might need to find other forum to discuss this in a more speedier way, overcoming the difficulties that I already mentioned of excluding people. And I think that it's important to be inclusive, not inclusive of other countries, but inclusive in general, including public participation into this. And so it's time that everyone understands clearly and then can have an informed decision about supporting it or not supporting it. And I think that only science will be able to inform that clearly.
Okay, thanks very much, Thelma. Anna Maria or Doug, would you like to come in on that one?
I don't think it's just a question of having the right scientific information. I doubt we'll be able to have everything we need to know if indeed we can define what that is. It's also a question of values and ethics and sort of the world that you want to have in the future. And there are very different views on that. So although I disagree with that last statement by Thelma, with respect, I do agree that the only way to mediate this debate is through inclusive engagement and participation. And I think there's been limited debate at all levels and with all actors, but certainly it's only starting to emerge or is rather fledgling within at the level of citizens themselves. And so there is much work to be done in having this conversation, and it's probably the most important thing at this stage.
Indeed. Thank you, Anna Maria. Doug,
Yeah,
any last thoughts there, or otherwise I'll let Thelma come back?
I was just going to say, I don't think we're going to have perfect science. I don't think we're going to have perfect governance. I think we will do the best that we can. And I think if climate impacts stay the way climate impacts are in 2020, quite honestly, I don't think we're ever going to, I don't think anybody's going to say we should go do this based on current climate impacts at the international level. But I think we need to be prepared, which we obviously were not for COVID, for example. We need to be prepared for the possibility that climate impacts might get an awful lot worse, and something might trigger a serious discussion. And we should be as prepared as we can be, and acknowledging the fact that it's not going to be perfect, but we should still do the best we can.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, Thelma, would you like to come back on either of those? Or?
No, very quickly, because maybe I didn't make myself understood. So I think that science is important. It's not everything, but it has been formed countries, when they are in a more political forum like the Climate Change Convention. Science has informed for some, decisions, including the Paris Agreement on the well below 2 degrees and pursuing 1.5 because of the impacts that have been anticipated or projected by the IPCC. So I think that the point of inclusiveness, I think, I hope I have made it clear that it needs to be absolutely inclusive, including with the public participation on this, because otherwise you're going to have barriers. There's so many barriers to overcome to address this issue. It's not only the science barrier, it is the barrier of the social acceptability of this, potentially cost for some of these methods. So it depends very much on the method itself. So it has to be treated not under the broad umbrella, but specifically with the methods themselves, which have different impacts and different costs and different everything.
Excellent. Well, thanks to all three of you there for different perspectives on that. And please remember, we will be having campfire conversations about this with sharing of different perspectives on these topics. You've probably gathered, this is your first dipping toe in the water into this topic. It's a huge topic. It's complicated. There are a lot of unknowns. We've got a lot to learn about in a not too long time. So do join the conversation, do learn more. As I said, you can watch these presentations in this Q&A again. We have evidence briefs and policy briefs on the website at c2g2.net. You can download and do sign up to join us for more C2GLearn events in the future, which will look at these topics and others in more depth. So all that remains to be said now is to thank again our speakers, Thelma Krug, Anna Maria Hubert and Doug MacMartin, for their time and contribution to this important conversation, to the C2G team behind the scenes who you can't see, and of course to you participants for your questions, and thanks for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get through all the questions, but do join us next time, and goodbye for now.